This is Standing Watch. And now, Evangelist Norbert Link.
Greetings, everyone, and welcome back to our Standing Watch program. Is nuclear war unavoidable? Is war unavoidable? Is humankind predestined to fight in war up to the point where mankind would destroy himself unless Jesus Christ were to intervene to stop man's madness? Unfortunately, that is exactly what the Bible tells us. And when we now look a little bit into some of the statements which were made during this last week, we can see why the human carnal mind is really unable to understand not only the futility of human warfare, but also the absolute abomination of human warfare. Now, right now we are thinking of the catastrophe which the Americans caused in Japan at the end of World War II. And there are many who say that this was necessary to drop the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And I have here an article by Breitbart dated May 14 saying that this was necessary because the alternative to using the two atomic bombs was a U.S. Army invasion of the Japanese homeland beginning in October 1945. It would likely have extended well until 1946. The atomic bomb saved over 2 million lives, Japanese and American. But is that true? Many military leaders, American military leaders, Republican military leaders even, would disagree. I have an article here by Salon.com dated May 11 saying this. In a 1963 interview on the use of the atomic bomb against Hiroshima, President Dwight Eisenhower bluntly declared that, quote, "it wasn't necessary to hit them with that awful thing." Eisenhower was even more specific in his memoirs, writing that when he was informed by Secretary of War Henry Stimson the bomb was about to be used against Japan, quote, "I had been conscious of a feeling of depression. And so I voiced to him my grave misgivings, first on the basis of my belief that Japan was already defeated and that dropping the bomb was completely unnecessary, and secondly because I thought that our country should avoid shocking world opinion by the use of a weapon whose employment was, I thought, no longer mandatory as a measure to save American lives." Close quote. Eisenhower was not alone. Many of the top military leaders, mostly conservatives, went public after World War II with similar judgments. The President's Chief of Staff, William D. Leahy, the five-star admiral who presided over meetings of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, declared in his 1950 memoir, quote, "It is my opinion that the use of this barbarous weapon at Hiroshima and Nagasaki was of no material assistance in our war against Japan. The Japanese were already defeated and ready to surrender. My own feeling was that in being the first to use it, we had adopted an ethical standard common to the barbarians of the Dark Ages. I was not taught to make war in that fashion, and wars cannot be won by destroying women and children." The article goes on to say that just a few weeks after the bombing, the famous Hawk, who led the 21st Bomber Command, Major General Curtis E. LeMay, stated publicly that the atomic bomb had nothing to do with the end of the war at all. Further, many of those who had access to secret intelligence showing Japan's desperate attempts to end the war were deeply disturbed by the bombing. Fleet Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, stated publicly 2 months after Hiroshima, and I quote, "The Japanese had in fact already sued for peace before the atomic age was announced to the world with the destruction of Hiroshima and before the Russian entry into the war. The atomic bomb played no decisive part from a purely military standpoint in the defeat of Japan." But you might be surprised to learn what Mr. Nixon said about General Douglas MacArthur. The article goes on to say that as the 40th anniversary of the bombing of Hiroshima approached in 1985, former President Richard Nixon reported that, quote, General Douglas MacArthur once spoke to me very eloquently about it, pacing the floor of his apartment in the Waldorf. He thought it a tragedy that the bomb was ever exploded. MacArthur believed that the same restrictions ought to apply to atomic weapons as to conventional weapons, that the military objective should always be limited damage to non-combatants. MacArthur, you see, still President Nixon talking, was a soldier. He believed in using force only against military targets, and that is why the nuclear thing turned him off. Interesting words, interesting assessments, and still something is lacking here, because now it's limited to nuclear war. Now, the reference is made here also to conventional war, and it's said that the damage to non-combatants should be limited. But the mere fact that there is damage to non-combatants, the mere fact that innocent civilians die in a war, which they always do, should show us, even from that standpoint alone, why war is wrong, why a Christian can't really participate in it. Now that brings me to the next article by the New York Times, dated May 14, about President Obama. And notice what they have to say. And of course, the New York Times most certainly is not a conservative paper. President Obama came into office 7 years ago, pledging to end the wars of his predecessor, George W. Bush. He has now been at war longer than Mr. Bush or any other American president. Mr. Obama, who won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2009 and spent his years in the White House trying to fulfill the promise he made as an anti-war candidate, would have a longer tour of duty by the time he steps down as a wartime president than Franklin D. Roosevelt, Lyndon B. Johnson, Richard M. Nixon, or his hero, Abraham Lincoln. Publicly, Mr. Obama acknowledged early on the contradiction between his campaign message and the realities of governing. When he accepted the Nobel Prize in December of 2009, he declared that humanity needed to reconcile two seemingly irreconcilable truths: that war is sometimes necessary, and war at some level is an expression of human folly. But here's a problem. Human warfare is never necessary. Until we get to the point where we understand that human warfare is never necessary, we will have war. And so the Bible says, the carnal human mind does not know the way to peace. There are many examples in the Bible showing that when we are subjecting and submitting ourselves to God, and when we let God fight our battles, God will. If we have the trust and the confidence that God will fight our battles, He will. But if we think we have to take matters in our own hands, we pick up weapons, we kill innocent people, God will keep His nose out of our affairs. And that brings me to the third article I want to quote you today. An article again by Breitbart, dated May 17. Asked point blank what he thought of the widespread fear of Islam in the West, Pope Francis replied that his impression is that most people don't fear Islam as such, but rather Daesh, the Islamic State, and its war of conquest drawn in part from Islam. The Pope went on, however, to acknowledge that the idea of conquest is inherent to the soul of Islam, while immediately adding that, quote, one could also interpret the end of St. Matthew's Gospel, where Jesus sends out his disciples to all nations, as the same idea of conquest, close quote. The article goes on to say, it wasn't clear whether the Pope actually believes that Jesus' mandate to his disciples to evangelize the nations was truly equivalent to violent Islamic jihad, or whether he merely said this in order to appear balanced and self-critical. I mean, these comments, my friends, are appalling. absolutely appalling. The idea to suggest that Christ was telling his disciples to go on a violent rampage to evangelize the world is just absolutely, totally ungodly, totally unbiblical, totally terribly opposed to what Christ was teaching. He told Peter, when Peter took the sword at the garden to defend him in Matthew chapter 26 and in verse 52, put your thought in its place, for all who takes the sword will perish by the sword. That was Christ's teaching. Christ opposed war fought by human beings in every manner, shape, or form. It is the Catholic Church, my friends, which really gave Christianity a bad name, which abused the concept of true Christianity, and then went out on a war rampage and fought unbelievers, quote unquote, and supported the war against those. It is not what Christ taught. Christ taught the absolute opposite to what Pope Francis was suggesting here. I am absolutely upset about the fact that he would dare to say these kind of terrible things. Again, giving Christianity a very bad name. My friends, we got to understand what the Bible says about war, about human warfare. We have a booklet prepared, Should You Fight in War? And I would strongly recommend that you ask for a free copy. This booklet will tell you from the Old and the New Testament what God thinks about human warfare. And you might be very much surprised when you hear the truth about this completely and totally misunderstood matter. Thank you very much for listening. This is Norbert Link for the Standing Watch program.
Standing Watch is a presentation by The Church of the Eternal God, P.O. Box 270519, San Diego, California 92198. More information is also available at our website, eternalgod.org.